Psychedelic today. This is Joe Moore. I am joined by Dr. Priyanka Wali. How are you doing today?
Woo! I am ready. I'm ready for this. Thank you for having me, Joe.
Yeah, I got the chance to listen to your podcast for, I think, about an hour this morning, so I'm really fired up. I like the
Which
vibe.
episode did you see?
What was it? Not the one about ocular shingles. I think it was the Lou Gehrig's
Conan's,
one,
right.
maybe.
Yeah. Phil Rosenthal.
Yeah.
I know, yeah.
So that was fun, and
Yeah.
I like the
fun
attitude,
podcast.
right? It's like, not exactly shock jock with your co-host, but you're clearly bringing a ton of intelligence to the table, right? And like a really good perspective, I think.
Oh, thank you. The purpose, when I was brought in on that project, the purpose was really to help educate the general public about medical issues, but then do it in an entertaining and light and engaging way, and hopefully funny and uplifting. And it's been such a treat to work on this project. I've loved recording every episode and the callers sharing their ailments. It's been a truly transformative experience for me.
Oh, that's awesome. It is interesting what having a public platform like this does to your psychology. It changes you quite a bit, right?
Yeah. And I'd be so curious to hear your experience, but for me, there's always been a sense of caution given, I'm a Western trained MD. I hold multiple licenses. People have a certain expectation around the way I'm supposed to carry myself. And in this platform, there's really so much freedom to just be who you need to be a human being, which I think, let's be honest, at its core, we really need to recognize the humanity in our healthcare providers more than anything else. They're not robots. So I've really appreciated the inner work that has sparked for me in showing more parts of myself through the podcast.
Yeah, you just hit so many good things there. I have to take some notes. So, first off, like, it's been interesting, right? Like, the only license I hold is a driver's license. I don't have any other licenses. So I've had a lot of liberty, but at the same time, a lot of responsibility, because we need to be really good stewards of this space. And
there's plenty of bad drivers out there. So good driving is also important too.
Agreed. And don't drive high, people. Please,
definitely.
Please.
Yes.
And I know some of you out there are doing it, so stop it.
Right now, as you're listening to this podcast, pull over right now.
Yeah. So, like it's been really interesting to, have to play this kind of role. And I've almost shifted my personal narrative to like being, like super wildly pro psychedelic to like, well, I think I'm just really, really, really anti-drug war. and that's been a really interesting shift for me in the last period of time. I'm like, yes, of course, everything this field is doing, except we kind of already did it in the 50s. So we just have to like do everything over again, which is super annoying. But, it's also obnoxious to watch people just not recognize the history. And we really should.
Oh, totally. Yeah. I mean, just to piggyback off of that, I am Kashmiri Pandit, comes from a region in North India. As a person of color, owing allegiance and respect to the history of these medicines, specifically plant medicines, and really acknowledging giving credit where credit's due, essentially, and not unintentionally participating in the unconscious collusion of colonization in now this realm as well. So I feel you. I think we really do need to shift the way we are presenting these medicines. We need to completely shift the energy in which we're coming from and really start giving credit where credit's due.
I agree. So I'm smelling that we're going to have a really great talk on ancient psychedelic use. But before we go there, let's talk about the humanity of people with licenses and healthcare professionals. And I was chatting with somebody at a recent conference who's she identifies as being a recovering physician. I think she did about 1 or 2 years of work post-licensure and dropped right out of clinical practice at the very least. She's still a license holder, I believe. But, this idea that, these people sacrificed so much to become physicians. And we should respect that. We should. And, sometimes the bad behavior comes from wounds.
Not sometimes. I would say it pretty much 99.99% of the time it's coming from a wounded place.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And all it takes is an outside perspective to go, oh, like, what was their residency like? Oh my God, they didn't get to sleep for 2 years. Are you kidding me? Like the amount of accumulated baggage from that kind of process is just unbelievable to me. Not only just med school, but like the process of becoming, the full doctor you want to become. It's like rife with hurdles and horrible stuff. And we don't really see that. And your whole identity is wrapped up in this too, right?
Absolutely. I mean, you're putting it so eloquently. We're dealing with a system, first of all, that is not recognizing the importance of emotions in health, in well-being. Okay, we're dealing with a system that is still creating a dichotomy between the mind and the body. That's how the system operates. So when you take individuals that are coming into the system to train under it, it's causing harm. The lack of recognition of the mind and the body being connected, emotions being an important part of well-being, the lack of recognition of those two concepts causes harm. And you couple it with a sort of militaristic style training where you eat when we tell you to eat, you sleep when we tell you to sleep, you show up when we tell you to show up. That's all going to exacerbate the problem. Then, on top of that, if you take any person that had childhood trauma, attachment issues, PTSD prior to starting their educational experience in the Western medical system, you're ripe for creating a great breed of traumatized individuals who are then now going to be responsible for the well-being of other individuals. And so it's a very dangerous situation that we're in. And I don't like to use the word dangerous because I don't like being alarmist. I don't like coming off as that kind of energy. But the reality is that there are lots of people being harmed by the system. And it doesn't necessarily have to be that way.
Wholeheartedly agree. Yeah. Yeah, we could go on this tangent for a long time, and maybe we'll pause it.
Let's do it. But, let's go on the tangent.
Let's try a couple other things. So like it seems clear to most of us that we need to be working towards some sort of more holistic and or integrative approach to the practice of medicine, psychiatry included. And yeah, this frame that we have to operate in doesn't necessarily allow physicians to even operate that way, right? There's so many wild constraints that prevent a doctor from operating in the way they probably want to, honestly.
Correct.
And there's like, frustration on both sides, both like recipient and giver, right? It's
correct.
Yeah, it's tough. And
I can speak anecdotally. Please. When I was a medical student, I actually had signs and symptoms of depression, but I didn't realize I had that until I started my psychiatry rotation and I was interviewing patients with depression and realizing that, oh, there's actually not much difference between me and these patients. And then began the journey of starting therapy. Unfortunately, the system was such a challenging place to be in terms of lack of support that the depression worsened. And I was on antidepressants for a brief period of time. It wasn't until I graduated from training, from residency years later, that I then learned about the statistics that one physician dies by suicide every day in the United States. And it became so clear to me that this is not a me problem. This is a systemic problem, that we are creating hurt people that are then taking care of others. It's not a sustainable solution at all. Basic things, like I remember in medical school, and I ended up writing a one-person show about this in 2019. I remember very clearly as a medical student, in addition to the stress of just trying to survive and pass the exams and just do okay, I remember not I remember being hungry a lot. Like food wasn't provided. You had to kind of pay for your own food while you were on these really long 20-hour shifts. And I just think that, if you're teaching people to care for others, providing them with some basic needs, okay, I get it if you can't get that much sleep, but at least feed them. Maybe we could start by just nourishing their bodies and teaching them what safety and comfort feels like in your own body. Being hungry is not a state of well-being. So why are we teaching our medical students how to be healers while they're in a perpetual state of hunger? So there were lots of examples like that, for sure.
So, yeah, like I don't want to, I never want to make doctors the problem, right? It's like we're all byproducts of our environment, right? And how we got educated, right? And I guess let's say like if you had the opportunity to talk to some people just about to go into, their early residencies, like what might you give them for advice, or even young med students?
Yeah, absolutely. What I would tell anyone out there who's about to start training, if you're listening to this, I want you to remember right now, before going into this system, you are enough who you are. You are whole, you are integrated, and you are enough. And don't forget that, because the system is going to make you really deeply question that. The system is going to prey on those vulnerabilities and those insecurities. And I want you to remember that you are enough going into this. I wish someone had told me that. I really wish someone had told me that before I went to medical school.
Yeah. And let's give it a lighter spin. I know you did a piece recently, dating as a doctor. I'm also wondering, like, how would we spin that now? Like dating a psychedelically informed physician.
Oh my gosh. I mean, it's like, yeah, like, I was making some jokes about like, yeah, like in bed, what would the safe word be? Like, it's like consciousness. Oh, something like that. Oh man, I haven't gone on stage to joke about like dating stuff for a while. That was some of my earlier stuff, but gosh, yeah, I should probably do some new bits about it. I am working on a bit right now. It's not ready yet, but it's about the time I went to Arizona and I went to Peyote Way and had a peyote ceremony. And I'm still trying to work on that. It has nothing to do with dating, but that's the only sort of like psychedelic material that I'm weaving into it. And, I'll let you know when that's fresh.
Outstanding. And maybe this is a good transition to talk about you. Who are you to our audience? So internal medicine doc, you've got some ketamine assisted psychotherapy training from Polaris. Yes. You're doing work with the Temple of the Way of Light. What else? Yes. Have you completed the MAPS training as well?
Yes, I'm MAPS trained, and I'm slated to actually begin helping. There's an MDMA assisted trial for PTSD and veterans down at the West Los Angeles VA, and that's slated to begin at the end of 2023. So I'll be involved in that as well. Yeah, so doing lots of things in the research realm. And I was also involved with the USONA trial, which was the psilocybin for depression trial at UCSF. That trial has now ended. And I was a psychedelic facilitator for that as well.
That's great. How many sessions do you think you've been in the room for in like the clinical trial side?
I would say probably a handful. I was involved with the depression trials and Parkinson's, psilocybin for Parkinson's. So I'm not sure off the top of my head. I'd have to kind of check my notes, but I would say a handful.
Yeah. Right on. Was the Parkinson's at UCSF?
Yes, that was at the lab is called Tripper.
Yeah, that's great. That's great.
Yeah.
I love that. And obviously we need to be, one thing that kills me is that because of the drug war, we have like a half-century gap in data, right? Like what other field has this kind of gap in data? I don't think there is one, right?
Totally. Not to mention the wide amount of untabbed anecdotal data that's out there that is not being recognized at all. And yes, I get we live in a world where randomized control trials are the gold standard. And I, as a scientist, I stand by that. But denying anecdotal evidence, I think is really, it's unfortunate because it's still evidence. It might not be high quality evidence, but it's still evidence. So why throw everything away if it's not an RCT?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we, in my opinion, really need to do a better job at being aware of other kinds of data. Like RCT is, yes, of course we want RCTs. I'm not saying we should do less. We should do more for sure. Yeah. That said, there's so much good data, and we're throwing out, like, no theory is complete if you're throwing out data that could inform the theory further, exactly. Right? Or be inclusive of other things. And like, that just shows, okay, like, you're throwing out. So scientists generally in this space want to be seen as really, analytical, really serious. But they're throwing out these mystical things that can happen very regularly in these exceptional transpersonal states. And it's not like, I can understand that from a certain perspective, they're doing the right thing. But on the other hand, like, there's definitely some big errors and waste in that.
And that's exactly it. You said it best. It's from a certain perspective. That's, I think, the issue here. We're only thinking about it from a certain perspective. And this is where you think about principles of colonization come in, looking at things only from one perspective. If you start to bring in indigenous systems, indigenous ways of looking at data, then suddenly we do actually have ways to account for these other phenomenon that can't be objectively tabulated. And I start to think about, especially with the lab discussions, the lab meetings that I was actually in, we would be talking about designing a study to accurately capture a effect. It started to feel like I was in an MC Escher painting, where the stairs are going up and then you're going down and you're just like going round and round. And
it's closer to reality.
Right. You kind of have to take then a step back and be like, wait, what am I actually looking at here? I am of the school of thought that is starting to think that we actually do not have the science ready yet in terms of our own fundamental understanding of science to be able to correctly capture these experiences using the scientific method. So I think we're in our own MC Escher painting.
Right. Like, for when RCTs were kind of introduced into psychology, that was a big watershed moment for psychology.
Yeah.
But like, how do we go, okay, what's the new RCT, double-blinded RCT?
Exactly.
And like, how do we go further? I'm an advisor for this company, Interstate. I'll link you up. There's some LA people, and they had a really fun paper they published. I hope I'm okay to talk about this. Hopefully I don't get in trouble. But it was kind of critiquing, and I'll see if I can get permission to send this to you later. Critiquing psychology generally, saying, our measures, like our psychometrics, are actually pretty poor. Like, there's generally a broad agreement across psychology that psychometrics aren't great. And like, the tools used for diagnostics or like diagnosis aren't that excellent either. And, I think there's some broad agreement that people want to critique DSM, but we don't have to go there right now. But, you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, definitely.
So how do we, as the field of psychology, take a quick pause to say, hey, maybe we could all double, triple down and get better psychometrics. And like, let's hit pause for like a year. And then our psychology spend, like National Science Foundation and other groups, might go further and be more meaningful. And then a further point of saying, we need to be valuing the stories these people are telling us.
Right. I mean, totally, there was a story, I talked about this on my Instagram a couple weeks ago. there was a story published in British Medical Journal. This is really random. It actually has nothing to do with psychedelics, but I want to just use it as an example of some really interesting anecdotal data. So there was a person who all of a sudden started hearing voices. And the voices were talking to her and telling her things like, hi, you don't know who we are, but we're here to help you. And then she goes to her doctor and she says, I'm hearing voices. And so her doctor puts her on antipsychotic medications and the voices go away. And then she goes on vacation. She's on holiday. While she's on holiday, the voices come back and they say, listen, you need to listen to us. You need to go to the hospital immediately and you need to go to this address and you need to get your brain scanned. So she shortens her holiday. She comes back and the address that they give her is at a center that does brain scans. And so she tells her doctor that, look, these voices are telling me I need these brain scans. And, she's freaking out. And so the doctor initially is like trying to reassure her. And then finally the doctor was like, okay, I'll order the brain scan. And then of course the insurance system was like, no, we're not going to cover this. But then she eventually got it covered. So they get the brain scan and it turns out she has a brain tumor and she ends up getting it surgically resected. And in the article, they say after she got it taken out, when she was in her post-op period, the voices say to her something along the lines of, okay, we're glad you're okay now. Like we're going to go now. Bye. And then she never hears voices again. And that's it. And she was fine. Like she has no other, issues. How can you in the current scientific model explain that? Show me the RCT that's going to explain that.
Right. Exactly.
And we know with any theory, if there's, you can't, you said it best, you can't throw out evidence if it doesn't fit in the model, right? You have to make a new theory. So
agreed. Yeah. And revise it and keep working. We have a really similar story we tell. A friend of ours, in a holotropic breathwork painting, like after the session, no clue until post-diagnosis what happened, but he actually drew the exact anatomy of thyroid cancer that he had.
Oh, wow.
And they didn't realize it until like a few weeks after diagnosis and the imaging that it was like the same thing. So it's kind of like it appears as though there are external intelligences out there. We don't know where they're from or what they're doing. Yeah. And then, it appears as though the body and the subconscious kind of are real things that communicate with us in various ways, right? So it's and how do we want to think about that? And there's endless exceptional cases, like Stan Grof's When the Impossible Happens is full of these things.
Right. We're currently in a medical system where if you went to your doctor and they told you there are spirits causing your strep throat, there would be a lot of lawsuits pending, so I'm not saying it needs to be one or the other, but I am saying, can we explore, can we bridge, can we make peace with both realms, right? Can we try and find a common ground here? Because I'm not saying we need to go completely in one direction. I'm saying let's take the best of both worlds.
Let's take the best of all worlds. So
let's take the best of all worlds.
I'm reading Robert Anton Wilson's book from 1977, Cosmic Trigger. I think I'm working through it for the third or fourth time right now. Subtitle, nice. Final Secret of the Illuminati. But there's like this whole there's this whole talk track around. Everybody should read this, by the way. I think I'm going to host a book club on it soon.
Okay.
But this idea of model agnosticism, perhaps. Like there's so much we don't know about the universe. Like why are we acting so certain? And this is coming from the Niels Bohr Copenhagen interpretation of quantum physics of model agnosticism, like, wavical, particle, wave, like it depends on how we look at it, how it shows up. And what if we looked at it 20 ways? And yes, we did the brain scans. Yes, we took the neuroscience approach. Yes, we took the holistic TCM approach, whatever it is. And then we're coming at a problem with a lot more intelligence because we have all these frames, right?
Yes. So I share office space with acupuncturists. My clinic, there's me, and then there's acupuncturists, and that was very intentional because I actually was at another clinic down the street working in a traditional primary care clinic with only other doctors, but I found myself um, having better outcomes when my patients would go see the acupuncturist, and the acupuncturist down the street was like, oh, I'm having better outcomes when they're seeing Dr. Wali as well. So it was the best, it was both. So that's when I decided to actually shift to that, because I actually think the outcomes are better when you combine both worlds.
I have a friend in Kansas City, physician, doing ketamine infusions, not necessarily cap.
Okay.
They were having all the emergence phenomenon that people will show. And that's
Sure.
kind of when people freak out when they come out, for people who aren't sure. And that's what, like a tenth of the population maybe, or less. But they started actually pairing it with Reiki in the session. So it was like ketamine infusions with Reiki, and the emergence phenomenon just like dropped. Like there's no more kind of like wig outs, and they say the results feel better. They have, I haven't seen them like put together any data yet, but I wouldn't be surprised if they're tracking it. So I should check in on that.
That's amazing. I hope that your friend / colleague writes about that or publishes that. I think that's beautiful data. Very, very interesting experience. And, you know, the way I experience what you're sharing is that it seems to me that there's obviously a lot more going on than just giving someone ketamine. It's such a deeper thing than we give credit for. It's not just about the dose.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Setting, dose. There's a lot more. The setting is deep.
Yeah.
Right. So, all right, let's make a pivot here to ancient world stuff. So I did a lot of my undergrad studying religious history, religious traditions, and philosophy. So I spent a lot of time, like my kind of like guru, mentor, teacher was like a deep transcendental meditation guy. So he was like super duper Hindu oriented. So we spent a lot of time with Kashmir Shaivism, Bhagavad Gita, like all this fun stuff. So I roll my eyes when people talk about non-duality these days. I'm like, well, guys, they were doing it a long time ago, guys. Like, it's not new.
So, you know, I'm Kashmiri Pandit. So my multiple generations are all from the Kashmir Valley. You know, and Kashmiri Pandit is the term for Kashmiri Hindus that are from the valley, which is, exactly right. It's like the region of such rich spirituality. So that's so great. I love that you've studied that. That's rare. It's really nice to talk to another person about that. Yeah.
So like, it's clear, right? Like, in the very ancient texts, it looks very clear that there was psychedelic use. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So specifically, the last time I reviewed this data was specifically the Rigveda, and we're talking about the references to soma, which, to be clear, the language in the Rigveda it's old Sanskrit. Which is distinct and different than the Sanskrit that is of modern day. And there were about 10,000 verses in the Rigveda, and it was recited. It was spoken in verse. And there are multiple references to soma. And the big question, right? Nobody knows what is soma in the actual substance. And there's all these theories. One theory is that it could be ephedra, which is a stimulant, because they actually found traces of ephedra in the region, which is now modern day Turkmenistan. They found archaeologic evidence of ephedra, and these were in relics that would represent the Bronze Age of civilization. But the argument against ephedra is that it's a stimulant, and there's clear references to soma in the Rigveda that it had hallucinatory properties, right? The most common example, I'm sure you've read, Watson's book, Soma, is the Amanita muscaria mushroom. But that has now been debunked because there's multiple references in the Rigveda that soma is actually a plant that you crush and you drink the juice of it. And we know you don't need to do that with mushrooms. And so the theory that I am personally ascribing to the most is that Soma is some sort of ayahuasca-like analog using combinations of plants that contain DMT and MAO inhibitors to then create an ayahuasca-like experience with hallucinations and feelings of elation and connection to deities and whatnot. There's a couple of sources. Actually, I can't remember the name right now. But yeah, I think it's an ayahuasca analog, but...
So DMT containing plants are everywhere. So like odds are good on the DMT front. And MAOIs are probably not that hard to come by, right? Like Syrian rue is big in the Middle East.
Syrian rue.
I was actually talking with some classicists. So the world's foremost expert on the Mongols. He's studying at the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton or something. And then a classicist from UC San Diego who's big time in like the Mediterranean cultures. And we got, a couple glasses of wine. We started talking about the ancient, like, prehistory of drug trade, and how there was so much drug trade between, like, India and the Mediterranean. So, like, why would Syrian rue not be there, or acacia, or whatever it is, right? And the Rigveda was a long time ago. What, 5,000 BC maybe? It was like super old.
So it goes back to 12th or 7th. They actually don't know. It's between 12th and 17th century. But what kind of puts me in a bit of a like brain buster then is okay, so we know we have the Vedas, but then there's also the ancient Egyptians, right?
It's kind of similar time frame ish.
Well, this is the argument, right? I mean, people are saying the ancient Egyptian culture predates Hindu Vedic culture, and they're actually arguing that a lot of the Vedic inspiration comes from Africa. It comes from that region in Egypt. I think this is a hotly contested debate, but from what I understand, Egypt sort of predates what was going on in India, and it might have even spread in that region. Regardless, I don't know if you've had a chance to visit Egypt, but it's
so good.
Did you go to the Temple of Philae in Aswan? It was south.
I got to check a map. It was a long time ago.
Yeah.
Temple of Philae.
Temple of Philae in Aswan. It's several hours. Or you could fly.
Was it at the dam?
Yeah,
exactly. I made it there. That was awesome.
Yeah, so I don't know if you had that experience, but I walked into the temple and I had just finished working at UCSF with the psilocybin trials. So I was thinking about mushrooms. I was talking about mushrooms. And then I show up at the Temple of Philae and all I see are mushrooms. And just to be clear, I was stone cold sober, right? Like I was not under the influence.
Oh, I'm seeing that like oysters. It almost looks like oyster mushrooms coming out of the pillars.
Yeah, like the pillars are made of all these mushrooms. And I did a little bit more research, and there are some published theories. Like Stephen Berlant has kind of the probably the only published data I could find around his theory that the Egyptian pharaohs, their crowns actually represent mushrooms. And he has some references to support that theory. But, I think this is a part of history we really need to get straight, because it kind of shifts our understanding of the human experience, right? Like if the Egyptians were using this as such an integral part of their life and ritual, the last time I checked, I mean, they did pretty well for a civilization. So we could probably take a few pointers from them.
It lasted a lot longer than it looks like America's going to last, at least.
I know.
For sure. So, yeah, it's really interesting. I think you're right. Like, there is a lot of looking at history we need to do. Like, here we do a lot of stuff just like ancient Greece, because that's kind of our orientation, like lean on Eleusis. But the relationship between like ancient Greece and Egypt was similar to like colonial America's relationship to England, right? Like the fancy people would go back for Cambridge and Oxford and come back. And I love that. It was a similar relationship, I think, for a lot of that history. Yes. Like Alexandria was the biggest school. I think even Plato went. I think like Plato had a grandparent maybe that went, Solon maybe. Yeah, it's really interesting. Solon's not the right name. I'm going to get that wrong. Anyway.
I love that. I love how you're naming Plato's privilege. Like,
he's a hardcore aristocrat.
He had like really, privileged grandparents. That's why he was able to study in Alexandria. Hello.
Yeah. That's all it takes. You get remembered for many thousands of years.
Oh my goodness. So can you imagine there, for every Plato that exists, there's probably thousands of talented philosophers that existed out there that we will never know, but that they existed. That there were many Platos out there, but they didn't win the race, And I don't know how I feel about that, because we know that's happening all the time, right? Even in present day.
We don't have enough time to read everything, right? Like, do you have enough time to read all the scholarly internal medicine papers that come out? Right.
No,
like nobody
totally.
could, right?
Yeah.
So like one thing I feel really negligent on is I never took the time to study Spanish philosophy. So like in the corpus of, you're getting the training in Western philosophy, Spain gets left out for the most part.
Interesting.
And they had a really rich tradition, both religious philosophy and, more traditional philosophy. And I still feel negligent, decades later after my undergrad. So,
well, I feel super negligent because I studied abroad in Spain during college and was a Spanish minor, and I don't know enough about Spanish philosophy at all. So I take full responsibility for that negligence.
Noam Chomsky turned me on to the anarcho-syndicalist movement that I think got squashed by the fascist regimes in like the early 1900s. But the anarcho-syndicalist movement looked like the kind of utopian direct democracy that we kind of fantasize about sometimes, but
Interesting.
That's for another time. It was only not successful because fascism took hold in Europe at that point.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, it looked really good. It's like optional government. You're like, yeah, I want to be part of this group, or
right.
You can leave if you don't want to be. Like,
like you do you.
Yeah, but it's like direct democracy. None of this kind of tomfoolery we're seeing today. Yeah.
Right.
So ancient traditions. I think you're spot on here. Like we need to be really looking at this. Brian Muraresku did a good job raising the profile of ancient psychedelic use in the last couple of years. I would love to see more people come to the table with similar narratives, right?
Yeah, I think it's a bit of a challenge right now. The political situation in Egypt makes it really challenging to sort of
I want to go back so bad, but I'm like a little freaked out right now to go back.
Right. And, it's illegal to engage in worship in the Egyptian temples. Egypt is a Muslim country, so
I know some people that have pulled some strings to make it happen, but
totally
hard.
And it does happen, but you kind of have to bribe someone or whatever, right? So the fact that there's so much kind of lockdown around just even the exploration of that makes it super hard to actually study this, because that would be a huge admission if we found enough data to recognize, like, hey, actually plant medicines were a big part of Egyptian culture and they defined the culture. That's a huge paradigm shift, because then we really need to take a hard look at substances that are straight up banned, especially in Muslim countries, but even here in the United States. So I don't even know if our consciousness is ready for a paradigm shift like that. There's so much fear. There's so many issues.
Like, am I really ready to eat these 2 hits of acid? I don't know. I'll find out in 30 minutes.
Now, listeners, he's doing it right now. It's happening right now.
So have you had the chance to dig into the work of Graham Hancock at all?
I don't believe I have.
So you got to check him out.
Okay.
He's coming up on the podcast really soon. He's been on.
Oh, nice.
Been on Rogan probably 10 times.
Okay.
But he's
yes,
this kind of like ancient. Yeah. His new series is Ancient Apocalypse on Netflix.
On Netflix, right. Yeah.
I just recorded with him a few weeks ago. I think I had 102-degree fever, no voice, but I'm like, I prepped so hard for the interview. I'm like, I'm not going to throw this off. So, but it was one of my favorite interviews in the last bit of time, and we got into ancient psychedelic use, like how the historical timelines might actually not be right, how we might need to push them back a few more thousand years or a lot of thousands of years.
Sure. Yeah.
Based on some of his observations, and psychedelics play a big part in his story, but he's also admitting that it's not necessarily psychedelics. It's like ritual practice can give us access to these other things.
Oh, totally. I mean, to be clear, these medicines, all they are portals. They're just portals that open the doors to other states of consciousness. These states of consciousness can be accessed through other means. You know, there are certain Vedic chants that are very powerful that actually should not even be recited unless under the supervision of a skilled Vedic guru. And so there are ways to open these portals without the use of medicines, which you see this, right? Like you see this sometimes in people, they engage in ceremony. And at least I can say let's say the ketamine practice is another example, because that's like a real clinical example. There are some individuals who, being sensitive, they don't need that much medicine to achieve the states of consciousness that they need to heal whatever issues, right? It has nothing to do with the dose. And so to your point, like it's about the ritual, it's about the set and setting, and it's also about the individual's baseline energetic state. I do think there are individuals that are more sensitive and they can access those states more easily. You don't need psychedelics. I don't think it's like an essential thing. I think it can be an extremely helpful tool, but it's absolutely not essential.
Yeah. I know a lot of spiritual seekers, they're, many decades down their path, and they look at psychedelics, they just say, no, it's not for me. It doesn't fit into my tradition whatsoever. I'm like, well, look at those guys' results, and like I'm seeing it now get incorporated in interesting ways in these old traditions. Like it's fun to see how people are trying to make it work for them and their traditions.
Totally. And as a Kashmiri Pandit, I personally am very excited about finding out the answer to this. I hope in my lifetime I will get some answers around what soma was, what the Rigveda was talking about. For my ancestors, there's personal stuff at stake for me to learn about this.
Yeah, I love that. And it's such a cool thing to think about. Like there, like you said earlier, there is debate, right? Which culture is oldest? And some people think the Hindu culture is the oldest, and it's really fascinating to think that. Yeah. But yeah, you're right. Like we don't know, but we can play with these things. Like I think we should have a level of playfulness as we engage this. Otherwise, the life kind of dies from it, right? It's either,
oh my gosh,
think about the enraptured telling of the Iliad and the Odyssey and or the Rigveda. Like they probably did it with so much gusto and love and power.
Yes.
That it's very different from, yet another CME talk.
Yeah. I mean, if you've ever listened to Vedic chants being recited, there's a depth and it's really medicine when you listen to it, when you allow the vibrations of the words to kind of enter your sphere. It's very powerful. It's beyond storytelling. And even though I don't speak Sanskrit, I can tell you I experienced something when I listened to those chants. And I love that because it has connections with the practices in, let's say, South America, right? With the Shipibo and singing Icaros, and the idea that our voice is part of our medicine. To me, it kind of brings in all these themes about even the chakra system and the throat chakra and principles that really, again, connect the mind and the body. Singing is one of those acts. It's unique as a performance. Singing is distinct than, let's say, stand-up. Stand-up is just straight talking, right? In order to sing, you need your whole body. You cannot sing without your entire body. So it's one of the types of performance art that's fully embodied.
Mm-hmm. I can really see that, yeah. And like you are activating this, you're often kind of like doing gesticulation.
You need your diaphragm, your body,
head position
your voice.
Matters, right?
Yes, everything.
Yeah, posture, like Alexander technique and all that. Like it's interesting. I only did like 2 hours of vocal training, but I think it is a really big thing. Like if people don't think they're skilled enough for a musical instrument, stretch your vocal cords. Like it's such a good thing.
singing uses your entire body, right? Which like it dance, for example, dance, you are using your body, but you're not using your voice, right? So yeah.
Yeah. Is kirtan part of Kashmiri Pandit like practice at all?
So I'm not entirely sure where kirtan comes from, but
Yeah.
it's essentially the singing of Kashmiri Bhajans, or holy songs. It's certainly, I grew up with kirtans. I grew up singing bhajans. That was kind of part of our culture. And there are some beautiful Kashmiri Bhajans, devotional songs, devotional spiritual songs. And it's funny you mentioned that. I was actually, this morning, I was getting ready for this podcast, and I was just missing my grandmother, who passed many years ago, and she would sing Kashmiri devotional songs. So I played some this morning, and it always it makes me feel like she's still here, and she's energetically certainly still very much here.
Yeah, that's awesome. I was at a holotropic breathwork retreat in upstate New York, Omega Institute, many years ago.
Oh, yeah.
I think it was Stan Groff and Jack Cornfield were leading it. But
Okay.
we had some kirtan people that were actually leading us through chants at night, and it was really beautiful. Like at in the evening, everybody, like 120 people all doing it, and call response kind of style, and it was so fun.
Nice.
And felt so great. And
yes,
singing is awesome. Singing in a group is next level.
yes.
Yeah.
Well, we evolved that way. In traditional Kashmiri culture, it was routine to gather together and sing together. We humans were supposed to gather around the fire and dance and chant, and there's actually something very healing for our bodies. And let's not forget how our nervous systems regulate with each other. And so being physically together as a group, as a collective, singing, using our bodies, it's actually very healing for the nervous system. So yeah, like we need more of that. We need to bring that back in.
I love that, like regulating together. And then, what would it look like if everybody ate a gram of mushrooms beforehand?
Right, right. Exactly.
I think that's a worthy experiment.
Yeah, that's a great question. And again, we have so much to learn from the Shipibo and other indigenous tribes located in the Amazon that engage in ritual in community, in groups, right? And other parts of the world, the Native Americans. We have much to learn from them. And if the sort of cultures from India and the Middle East have been lost to whatever reason, I think we can look to our brothers and sisters in the Americas for guidance. Because we all came from Africa, so we all came from the same place. And maybe some of us got a little lost along the way, but we can be found.
Right. Like, to assume somebody is in a whole race or culture is damned forever is silly these days.
Yeah.
A lot of people want to suggest that in our current climate, but I think there's a lot of redemption possible, a lot of growth and healing possible.
Yeah, there's a term, sankofa, which basically means going back to that, going backwards to gain and get that which was yours. And so it's okay for us to revisit old indigenous practices, to just see what is there. And I do think in terms of moving forward, we need to take what works from the past and incorporate it to the modern times. I think we need to adapt and evolve. And there is ancient wisdom. I wonder, for example, the ancient Egyptians, based off of the data that does exist, it seems like the priests were the only class that had access to psychedelics. So like, I wonder, the pharaoh. So like, you wonder about that, right? What was the reasoning behind that? Was that actually the case? And, obviously we do not live in that time now. I mean, everyone can, if they know the right people, they can eventually get access to things. And so we're not living in that world, right? But I wonder why the Egyptians had that ritual. What was there to learn from that? These are questions worth exploring. I'm just curious about what the answers could be. And
Yeah.
there are situations where I think psychedelics aren't. I still think psychedelics aren't for everyone. I think we know, like in the research trials, there's absolute contraindications for people taking certain types of psychedelics. So if there was a little bit more exploration, and back to your point of the war on drugs, if we stopped criminalizing this and we started getting curious about it, we could probably come to a much better situation, a much safer situation for people.
Agreed. Yeah. And let's restate this too. Like, we're half a century in a data hole. There's more psychedelic use now than probably ever on the history of the planet. And
interesting.
Yeah, like definitely more than the 60s. And, the government isn't funding psychedelic research to any, extensive degree. I'm a board member of this group, Psychedelic Medicine Coalition. And this is our objective, is to get science funding direct to psychedelic research from the federal government. And it's really inappropriate that there isn't federal funding right now at scale.
Right.
It shows kind of a negligence on public health and safety, like a lack of interest, lack of scientific curiosity, perhaps, or intellectual honesty, maybe, on the science funders.
Right.
Yeah. So I'm actually doing a part of a congressional briefing on Tuesday, going to DC for my first time to talk to the guys in suits there. That should be interesting.
Oh, good luck with that.
Thank you.
That's exciting.
Yeah, it's cool. I think we got Rick Doblin, Tim Ferriss, Matt Johnson from Hopkins, and Wiz Buckley. He's like a Top Gun instructor or something.
Okay.
So an interesting cast of characters.
What a crew,
pitching.
yeah.
Yeah. I think I'm not necessarily giving the briefing. I thought I was, but yeah, I think I'll be there and I'll help support them.
Right on.
Yeah.
Cool.
So it's really interesting, right? Like how, and it kind of is like a future ancient. Have you seen this term, like future primitive or like ancient?
No.
It's the idea of we're trying to like merge ancient and contemporary.
Right.
Like how do we pick the best of both for like the, greater good of the planet?
Exactly. It goes back to our earlier theme, the best of multiple worlds, right? Mm-hmm. That's evolution. That's adaptation. You take the good and you leave that which doesn't serve us.
There's a classic in kind of new age science culture called Thomas Kuhn's what is it? The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, I think it's called, and it talks about like paradigm shift. Like how crazy was that guy that was like suggesting people wash their hands before surgeries?
Right.
Like, I think he was locked up.
He ended up in an insane asylum. Poor person. Yeah.
Right. Louis Pasteur was probably thought to be crazy for a bit.
Right. Yeah, no, I was just reading about that story about the gentleman with the hand washing. Poor guy. It was just, all he was doing was observing that when the midwives would wash their hands, that fewer people would die. Like, that's all. It was like,
just don't observe too closely.
Yeah, it's like the power of the danger of observation. Can you imagine how crazy that guy must have felt? Yeah, like, can you imagine how isolating? And no wonder, if anyone needed psilocybin, that poor man needed some psilocybin. Because can you imagine how isolating and depressed he must have been to kind of realize that? I don't know. It's just,
you rewind the tape, Galileo.
Like, right. Yeah,
how much more abstract is that? It's not even directly involving saving lives. It's like just threatening the church's position in European culture.
Yeah. There's so many different traditions that haven't been listened to. So
So let's take this assumption. I have an interesting question for you. Could be
Absolutely.
A dangerous one, but I love dangerous questions. So
okay.
It's obvious that cultures around the world have suffered due to like Western imperialism, colonialism, etc. Right? Like even early peyote culture was really stamped down by the Roman Catholic Church, and at that time, like whatever that meant for world empire. And this happened worldwide. It was somewhat systematic, I think. Like a lot of the wisdom keepers were just kind of killed, imprisoned, removed. Like a lot of literature was removed. Like we lost everything at the Library of Alexandria to bring it back to Alexandria on account of the Roman Empire, aka Catholic Church. And like, how do we want to look at this from a global perspective? Because like I have this intuition based on my knowledge of like the Western traditions that, you know, this kind of suppression started 1,000 years before, you know, the Western world, like the indigenous communities got impacted, right? Like the witch trials, like, you know, the Gnostics had to flee and hide their books all over the Mediterranean, right? So like there was magical traditions and probably traditions with psychedelics all over Europe in my tradition, in my theory. But it's like, how should people of European descent kind of like, number one, be careful, but also like know that they had, you know, a couple thousand years of terror on them as well.
Exactly. Yeah.
But like, how do we also be sensitive to go like, okay, these guys' wounds are, you know, a couple hundred years old or really fresh too, like upwards of 20 years old, like, but all the way to like 700 years back. It's like, how do we contextualize history appropriately around like what our culture has done, but also respect that like, yeah, we were hurt by these same people just like a couple hundred years or 1,000 years before.
Right. Every tradition, every person from every tradition has at some point experienced oppression or trauma. I think we need to recognize that we all carry the pain of our ancestors, the tears that our ancestors couldn't cry. They're crying through us. And if you zoom out, you know, from an energetic perspective, I think it's important to recognize that part of the human experience is experiencing fear. That is an essential mark of the human experience. You can't escape that. The fear is there. That's what it means to be human. Collectively, you know, these stories of oppression and stamping out magic and all these cultures being destroyed, it's really an embodiment of an inability to tolerate fear, an inability to tolerate discomfort. And in lieu of being with the fear or the pain, one would rather create more pain. Or as Resmaa Menakem talk about in his book, My Grandmother's Hands, which is an excellent book to understand racialized trauma from a therapist perspective, a trauma-informed perspective. But he talks about the creation of dirty pain. When we experience pain, we have the option to just be with that pain, or we can create dirty pain. And examples of dirty pain would be behaviors to numb the pain or lashing out at another person. And he talks about racism as an example of dirty pain. Because you're in pain yourself, you can't bear it, so you'd rather take it out on someone else who looks different than you. I think that is what has happened. I do think we are capable of the next shift in consciousness. I think the next shift in consciousness is recognizing that we experience fear as part of the human experience, but we can choose not to give into it. We can be with it. We can allow it to be there. We can even honor it, but we don't have to act on it. And we can instead choose the path of peace or love, or not even choose those paths, but just choose not to do anything with the fear. Choose not to oppress someone, judge someone, lash it out, numb it, you know? And this is where issues like the fact that we live in a capitalist society really come to be a problem with engaging in this next level of shift in consciousness, because we currently live in a society that encourages us to numb our pain. It is designed, there are business models designed to cater to that need, that fear that we all possess as human beings. And so unless we in the present day begin to start being with our fear, we will continue to perpetuate these cycles of oppression. And it's been going on for thousands of years, but it's possible that we can shift to a new level of consciousness. I believe it. And I say that as someone who struggles with fear all the time, every day. It's a process to always be with those feelings and understand that doesn't mean there's something wrong. It's just part of being human. Like, that's what's up.
There's a lot more similarity cross-culturally in the human story than difference. Yeah.
I know.
There's a term you picked up there that I just want to throw it out. Othering a certain group of people.
Yeah.
There's another term for it, subspeciation. You make them another species almost. So you're not, wow. I'm not the same species as them. So therefore it's easier for me to do bad stuff, you know?
Yeah.
It's really ugly. But it's, you know, we should name it and understand the structure of it a little bit, right? And
I think right now, kind of with, at least here in the United States, with all of the racial trauma that does exist, right now it's critical that, you know, we can't begin to heal the pain unless we acknowledge that it's even there, right? And the lack of acknowledgement is doubly painful, because it's like gaslighting a person's experience. But in this situation, you know, when people say like things like racism doesn't exist in America, or I don't see color, or whatever, you know, it's kind of like, well, you know, that's good for you, but you're also gaslighting the experience of literally millions of people of color in the United States, and now really the world, right? Because it's spread.
I like to say worldwide.
This
is a really shitty joke. I'm going to say it anyway. I'm probably going to get in big trouble. Like,
are you sure you want to do this?
I'm going to do it.
Are you sure you want to do this? Okay.
Yeah.
I may not laugh. I'm just going to.
That's fine.
I may not laugh.
Yeah. Like,
I may roast you if it's that bad.
Please do. Like, where in the world is oh, no, I'm going to say it really horribly. The essence of the joke is like,
I'm getting ready
the rest
to
of the world
you.
is just wildly racist too. It's not just the United States. This is a global problem.
Yes,
and it's not.
That's true.
It's really bad. Like,
wait,
you look at how people
joke?
treat each other. I had the structure of it. The setup was going to be a joke. I just forgot how to say
racism I mean, racism and it's colonization. This is all. It's all colonization. The whole world has been colonized, and it's one of the biggest illusions that we have all bought into. And that I'm speaking from the teachings that I have received from one of my teachers, Dr. Rosales Rocia Mesa. But it is an illusion that we've all bought into. And capitalism is one of the sort of agents of colonization as well.
Sure. It's a really powerful framework for controlling like the frame and the dialogue, right? It's like all about money.
Which is crazy if you think about it. Like, I can't believe we all bought into it. We really bought into it. But when you put someone's survival and well-being on the line, people will buy into stuff real quick when it comes to survival.
Yeah, and that's often what it comes down to, right? And like a lot of the lower classes here in America are just like it's pure survival.
And I can speak. You know, I'm the daughter of immigrants. Again, my family's Kashmiri Pandits. We experienced a genocide in 1990. I was in Kashmir in 1988, 2 years before the genocide. And so there was a massive diaspora. And I was born in the United States, but being the daughter of immigrants who came to the U.S., I know very clearly what that felt like to have that drive to survive and make it and be okay. I mean, it's a very palpable contraction, and it's very real. And immigration, whether it even voluntary immigration that a person wants. Forget about forced immigration. Any type of immigration from one world to another is still traumatic for the individual.
It's a crazy transition.
It's an insane transition.
Yeah. And you know, we should absolutely respect that and like look into that further. It's and it's coming, right? Like people, I'm not slang and doom here, but you know, the projections are that enormous portion of the world population will be dehomed by the climate crisis, and we're going to have to be really good at the psychedelic psychotherapy stuff and become a lot better at taking care of refugees worldwide. Like, one thing I would love to see is how do we become less and less tribalist, right? Like, you know, we think of like two warring tribes like going at it a long time ago and or recently. how do we transcend that and become like more global citizens?
Right.
And less Djangoist, like the rhetoric, like all these people who are leftist, like kind of anti-war leftists, are now like super pro-war, given what's going on in Ukraine. And it's like, how did you become, anti-war and now you're pro-war? It's like a weird shift. And like all war is really, really nasty, in my opinion, to be avoided as much as we can.
Yeah. I mean, I agree. As someone who is still dealing with the after effects of genocide in my own community, war is bullshit. Can we swear? I don't know if we can swear.
Please. A little extra. And I guess like to add some color here, people, often there's so many genocides that Americans don't know about. Like I have some friends that were really impacted in the Armenian genocide. I think that was a really ugly one. And in your family's case, was that part of like India, Pakistan kind of war in the early 90s?
Yeah, so actually I would say it was actually more of an indirect result of colonization and the impact of British imperialism, which then required Hindus and Muslims to move and relocate based off of their religious preference. And Kashmir was sort of a hotbed where Hindus and Muslims had lived. And of course there were generations of sort of fighting, but it's the Hindus were indigenous to that valley, and we still are. And so it was sort of the last sort of siphoning out of all Kashmiri Hindus in that region in 1990. Yeah.
Because it was like effectively India's Switzerland. That Kashmiri Valley is so gorgeous. I've looked at pictures forever.
Yeah, so I actually went in 2012 with a police escort and a lot of sort of protection. And, I'm not sure what your ancestry is, but there was something about like my body returning to the land where my ancestors were from. I can't tell you how healing that was, but
I'm an asshole and haven't done that yet. I need to.
Yeah, like there was an element of yearning that was satisfied. Now, granted, though, it was in the backdrop of like military people. There were people holding guns everywhere. Like our ancestral home was now occupied by a military base. It was really stressful. We were constantly being told like, okay, you got to leave now because the situation's changing, the safety's changing. So it was a stressful trip. It wasn't like this beautiful homecoming. But despite the fear and the stress, there was a tiny part of my body that was like happy to be home, where the people look like me and they speak a language that my grandmother would speak to me. And there is something about returning to your own land that I think is therapeutic.
Yeah. There's this big time conservationist. I'm going to go 2 tracks here. Big time conservationist. I think he's working on developing perennial wheat to help recover soils, because we're kind of losing soils at an accelerating rate as well. So like, how can we actually feed people and heal the soil at the same time? And he's working on that at Wes. A beautiful poet too. But he's always telling people to move back from where they grew up at the very least. Because they understand that ecosystem a lot better and can plant better food and whatever else. And, further back, not further back, a different talk track, like the famous Terence McKenna always talked about dominator culture and how this is like a massive thread in human history. And like, it's a story as old as time, right? Like any civilization was probably doing dominator culture. Even to this day, probably is doing dominating culture. Like, how do we just dominate the other?
Right.
And so like the extension, like, what the last maybe 600 years of European colonialism, it's just, they had better technology and could get around the world quicker than they could in like the ancient times, like ancient Greece, ancient Macedonia, etc. Like empire and colony building was always been there. Big histories of it in Asia as well. So it's like, And is it this shift from a matriarchal culture to a patriarchal culture? And maybe how do we figure out what's the sweet spot balance between patriarchy, matriarchy?
Right.
Or like, I don't know. Do we shift every 4 years? Do we try to blend the two? Like, what do we do?
Like 4,000 every 4,000 years. Yeah,
that's the history as it goes. It's going right now every 4,000 or 5,000 years. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. That's I don't know the answer to that.
It's just
one.
empire game. Like how I kind of see it is we're doing, and our European ancestors, in my case, are doing the same program that has always been done. It's like, oh, those people are weaker and have stuff we want. Cool.
Yeah, let's go do for it. Yeah. So, I mean, like, you'd think we would have made some more progress as human beings, as a species, but, clearly there's work to be done. I do think we are in amidst a transformation in consciousness. I don't know how long it's going to take, but I think, we're definitely transforming. Yeah. And it's time too.
It feels like it's sinking with like, all right, shit's getting really hot over here. Like we need to prep. So it feels like there's a coming of that consciousness to help address these coming crises that are going to converge and be really nasty for us.
Yeah, that's a really nice way of putting it. I mean, climate change is going to be a major come to Jesus moment for humanity. It already is. It's happening, right? It literally snowed in Southern California yesterday. It's March.
Doesn't sound like global warming to me.
Yeah. So I mean, yeah, if there's something that's going to bring us back into our bodies, it's definitely going to be Mama Earth.
I'd love to see like what we got to wrap soon. Like the psychological impact of big catastrophes, right? Like let's look at like post Katrina New Orleans, right? Or like other hurricane zones.
Yeah, there's actually compelling data. There's lots of different aspects of published data in environmental science, and the kind of the most interesting example that sits with me, just because I don't think there's an RCT that we can do on this, but in Japan there was a tsunami, the massive tsunami that led to the Fukushima plant issue and whatnot. Well, after that tsunami happened, there were a large number of people who were claiming to see ghosts. There were a lot of anecdotes of taxi drivers that would pick up people and then they would drop them off at their destination. By the time they'd arrive at the destination, they'd turn around and there was no one in the taxi cab. So how do you explain that?
It's a good way to skip out on your bill.
Right. Be a ghost. And so some theories to explain this is like, was this a form of severe PTSD as a result of climate change where people were actually having paranormal experiences? I don't know, but it's certainly like an extreme example of some of the effects of climate change. Obviously, the basic ones, no food, no water, starving, no home, all of that stuff, that's all going to lead to PTSD. But I found this case to be really interesting because it was, I don't know how to explain it, Yeah.
Yeah, we could speculate for hours.
Yeah, that's another podcast. That's unsolved mysteries.
I want to keep going.
Yeah.
But like people, if you're curious about this, like climate change and like the converging crises, check out the work of Michael Rupert. Talked about how things are just going to stack up. And at a certain point, we're going to run out of money and we can't repair everything. And then it just gets uglier and uglier from there. So we've got to do our best to address this thing.
Right.
And learn.
That's a very uplifting note to end on.
Yeah, totally. So, it's just a call to action. Like raise your consciousness, learn as much as you can, build some community. But yeah, I guess like in summary or like any final notes. Yeah.
Oh man, how do you wrap up a discussion like this with a nice little bow tie?
Yeah, good Lord.
I think what I loved about this conversation is this idea. Let's bring in the best of all worlds. That's part of the evolution. Bring in the best of all worlds. Be with your fear. Don't numb it. Don't get rid of it by putting it on someone else. Be with your feelings. And check out my podcast, HypochondriActor, releases every Wednesday. And follow me on Instagram, Wali Priyanka.
And who's your co-host there on the podcast?
Sean Hayes. He was on Will and Grace. And he also is the co-host of Smartless podcast.
Awesome.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Dr. Priyanka Wali, thank you so much for being here. I hope we get to do it again.
It was such a pleasure. Likewise. Yeah, this was super fun. And maybe I'll see you in LA.
That would be fun. That would be fun. I hope so. All right.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks.